statement, the authority for regulations, enforcement, offenses, and penalties are in the Radio Communication Act. And at the back of the Act, it talks about what the penalties are for particular offenses. The second document is the Radio Communication Regulations. They get their power from the Act. They have no power in themselves. And that's where people get confused. So the Radio Communication Regulations is a group of regulations that have been created, and they're basically general regulations. The way they did these regulations is they made a whole bunch of regulations that are common to all radio services. And then in special cases where they needed to add different types of regulations and for specific things, as in the amateur service, which has a lot of exemptions from all this type of stuff, they have one section, I believe it's section 47, that contains all of the regulations for amateur. So the way to look at it is that the amateur regulations in section 47 plus all the general regulations covering all the other radio services control the amateur radio service. Okay, so I'll have to reprint this because we've changed our name now. I think I can remember our name now. Is it ISEC, Industrial, Scientific, Economic Commission or something like that. I'm not using. No, we're not called Industry Canada anymore. It's still in our documents, and they decided to change it. I don't know why they've changed it. Everybody gets used to it, and all of a sudden they got to change it.
Yeah, that's why they do it.
Eh?
That's why they do it. Because you got used to it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know. Economic. I said that's what it's. I said. We're joking about it now. You do it because I said so.
Oh, I said no.
Yeah. So we might have fun with it yet. Anyway, Industry Canada, which is now, as I said, is responsible for the administration of the Radio Communications Act. So everything that's in the Radio Communication Act has been delegated to Industry Canada, which is now, I said, Industrial, Scientific, Economic Development. That's it. Yeah. They are responsible to take care of it under the authority of the ministry. All radio services are defined within the Radio Communication Regulations. Remember I said that the Radio Communication Regulations talks about all radio services, and then it specifically picks out a few sections to cover specific instances of types of radios. So if you want to find out what a radio service is, what type of radio service, how it's been defined, you won't find it in the Radio Communication Act. That's just the authority to make these regulations. You will find it in the Radio Communication Regulations themselves. Something really, really important to know, and this will probably answer a lot of questions on the exam in one form or another. Amateurs may not transmit out of band. In other words, if the frequency has not been assigned to the amateur radio service, don't be on it. Nor can you communicate with any stations outside of the amateur radio service. So they have to be an amateur radio station on amateur radio frequencies in order for you to communicate with them. There is only one exception to this rule, and it's a little dicey, but basically this: if you hear a mayday or a plea for a life, protection, and property on a frequency, and nobody answers it, and they're not an amateur radio station, you can answer their request and render aid and contact the people they need to be contacted. Only in that instance.
What about, I know in Canada, in the United States, they have the Mars program. What about amateurs contacting?
I'm going to talk about that now. That's what I said. This is what this is based on. Okay. There is an organization called the Mars program. That's a military amateur radio service. It's an American system. They have specific frequencies which are not part of the amateur radio bands, but they have been authorized to use them for communication between family members and different network stations to people that are overseas. And they have authorized amateur radio operators with advanced certificates that they have applied and been screened and so on. They're allowed to operate their equipment outside of the ham bands on these frequencies to communicate exclusively with the Mars stations. Okay? And we have a similar situation here in Canada called CFARS, Canadian Forces Amateur Radio Service, affiliated radio service, that's what it is. The same thing goes. We have Canadian stations that have applied for and been approved, and they use these same frequencies, and they intercommunicate amongst each other. But that does not mean that they can communicate as an amateur radio station. They have a different call sign, they're operating in a different service, they're just allowed to use their amateur radio equipment on those frequencies. Other amateurs that don't have that call sign, that don't have the rights for that, cannot communicate with these stations when they're using those call signs on those frequencies. Okay, all transmissions must be identified with a call sign. You will be assigned a call sign upon request. The first one is free. That call sign can be used with your operation of your station in any number of locations for any number of stations. You can use it for a repeater, you can use it for a portable, mobile, packet radio, whatever. But that is associated with your station. And the call sign that's associated with you is one that you're considered responsible for whatever goes on. And whenever you're operating your station, you need to identify your station every 30 minutes in Canada, or at the beginning and end of each transmission. That will be on the test. And that's point 6 right there. Stations must identify at the beginning, end, and at 30 minutes intervals. False or deceptive signals are not permitted. And that can be fake distress signals, that can be passing false information, trying to trick people with different things, anything like that. The court will see as false or deceptive, you're going to be responsible for. So you're not allowed to do that. There is no age requirement for amateur radio certificate. Anyone can have a certificate. If they're smart enough and they pass the test, they can have a certificate. They don't even have to be a citizen of Canada. They don't have to live in Canada. However, only someone who's living in Canada that has a valid Canadian address can have a call sign. So say a foreign amateur comes to Canada, decides to write all the tests, gets his advanced, gets his basic, and all the certificates for Canada, and then he's got a permanent address, he's living, say, spending the summer at his cousin's place or whatever, they can be issued a call sign, he can operate as a Canadian station. When he leaves Canada, call sign stays here. Yes?
If a Canadian amateur living in Canada visits somewhere else, can we still use our call sign?
That's different.
Okay.
A Canadian resident
Yeah.
can, and I'll talk about that. There's a special certificate. There's a combination of cooperation between the governments and the World Amateur Radio Council and the departments and that. They have a way of doing that. Restricted operator certificates are not considered equivalent to an amateur certificate. Many times you get calls that say, I've already got my radio certificate. Can I just go and use an amateur radio? No. You need an amateur radio operator certificate to use amateur radio. There are some exceptions. There are some older certificates, general maritime certificate, first class radio telephone. These are older certificates that are no longer issued. If anybody had one of these during their lifetime, if they come to the department, we'll hand them an amateur certificate, probably advanced. Because to get that certificate, they had to know more than the amateurs have to know now. So we recognize those certificates, but they're not issued anymore. And unfortunately, military certificates are not recognized. It's too bad because they're quite qualified in my opinion, but we don't have a mechanism for it, so unfortunately the guys that did radio in the military, unless they were smart enough to get the professional certificate on the side, we can't recognize it. The good news is that these guys can probably sit down and write the test like that anyway, and they're out the door. Okay. No radio license is required for amateur radio. A lot of people get confused. There are no amateur radio licenses in Canada. They're certificates. They're operator certificates. We got rid of the license. It no longer exists. So you have to have an amateur radio certificate to operate any amateur radio station. But there is no amateur radio license. If you look at your certificate, it doesn't say license. And only amateur radio stations may be operated under an amateur radio certificate. Because you've got your amateur radio certificate does not mean you can climb into an aircraft, use an aircraft radio, climb into a boat, use a boat radio, any other service that requires a specific certificate. The amateur certificate is not a fits-all one-size certificate. You still need to have your restricted certificate for maritime operation. You still need your restricted certificate for aircraft. You may not install, repair, or maintain amateur equipment for anyone not holding an amateur radio certificate. So you don't want to aid or abet getting someone on the air who doesn't have the authority. Stations may only be operated by and under the control of an amateur radio operator. That means you can operate your station, and as long as you're close by and able to take control of the station, you can allow anyone you want operate that station. You still remain responsible for their operation, and you have to be prepared to take over the station and do what needs to be done if there's a problem. So people that don't have a certificate, like your son or daughter, that they can operate, but you have to be in the room, you have to be there, be able to, yes?
Would they have to communicate your call sign?
Yes.
Okay.
They would be the operator. They would have to do that. They would have to follow all the rules, and you'd be responsible to make sure they did.
Okay. So between conversation, they'd have to end with your call sign.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. All equipment must be operated within the rules, regulations, and standards of the amateur radio service. You have your bandwidth limitations that we talk about. You have to stay within those. You have to stay on your frequency, and you have to follow the rules when you're using your radios. Secret codes, ciphers, and protocols may never ever be used. That means any secret little code or unrecognized formats cannot be transmitted on amateur radio. They have to be public domain, so that somebody who wanted to know what you were saying or doing would easily be able to do so.
Languages?
Foreign languages are permitted because they're known languages. But of course that can backfire sometimes too. But like I say, there's no rules on that. Everybody know the story about they call them wave talkers? Navajos? Yeah.
Oh.
They drove the Germans nuts for years because the Germans were trying to crack a code that the radio operators were using. But the Americans had the foresight to bring in Navajo natives to run their radio stations, and they spoke entirely in Navajo. They never did crack it. They thought it was a code.
There was a movie on that.
Wind Talker, that's it, Wind Talker. Yeah.
That was
Good movie, yes.
That was Japanese. They used Comanche German.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, there's two, right? Like, our language is different than most Europeans anyway, so.
Yeah. But this was one that really threw them for a loop.
Most of them get over that.
Okay, because only protocols considered to be public domain are permitted. I just said that, we're good. Broadcasts to the general public are prohibited. So that doesn't mean that you can fire up and say, "Welcome to the Rolly Show."
Rolly's got a show. What channel is that on? But isn't that public
I got
domain?
away with a lot.
Point there.
Mhm. Yeah, so that's no broadcasts are intended for reception to the general public. You're not allowed to do. Business, commercial, recorded material, or music are prohibited. So you can't play music, can't advertise your pizzeria, and so on and so forth.
Commercials, money.
Yes.
Money.
That's right. Transmissions can only include information of a personal or technical nature, which covers lots, but this stuff. Mm-hmm.
I was listening to a repeater, and there was two guys in the States. They were talking about their service at a gun store, and they named it, and they talked about their experiences there that were negative. I know that's under the American rule, but if the Canadian were to talk about a pizzeria and name it and talk about their review, does that?
Well, this is more aimed at running commercials.
Okay, so
You know,
motion.
like, welcome to the V3 SSM repeater. Eat at Joe's. You know,
Yeah,
that kind of thing. You know.
Yeah, I can say that I went to that. Dinner there, there's no problem
Yeah.
saying it. It's
Yeah.
not an advertisement.
Yeah. Station operator certificate and or certificate holder, which is going to be the same. Well, either one actually, is responsible for the operation of the station. Secondary users may not interfere with nor be protected from interference by primary users. If you've been doing any of your reading on your own there, you know about primary and secondary users. Frequency bands are allocated to the amateur radio service, and a lot of times we're sharing these bands. And in some particular instances, we're secondary to other operations. So if those operations are using the frequency when you get there, you need to get off because they have priority. And if they come on when you're on the air, you still need to get off because they have priority.
Well, that's like the 200,000 watts of the radio for Europe on 40-meter band. You're not going to compete with them anyway.
Well, that's a whole nother
What
can.
do you say?
That's political. They're getting into that.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Amateur equipment requires no approval or certification. You have a question?
I was just going to say, they're station operators, I mean a control operator?
Yes.
Oh, because that's what the question referred to as a
Yeah, control operator. Yes.
What does it mean by a control operator?
What it means is you can be in control. You can have
Okay.
somebody operating beside you,
Okay.
but you're still in control of the station.
Oh, because
You have a certificate.
Control operator and station owner.
Yeah, you could be either. You could be
Okay,
the
but it
owner.
said both of you are responsible for the proper operation,
Yes.
as opposed to, I thought only the one with the certificate would be actually responsible.
Well, this would be in a case of, say, for instance, you have a friend who has an amateur radio certificate, but never bothered to get a call sign.
Okay.
And one day he's visiting, and he's been for a while. He said, you got a ham station down there. I got my certificate. Can I play with your radios when you're not around? Yeah, sure. But he has to identify using his call sign.
He's qualified to use it, in other words. So a control operator is someone who's actually qualified to use it.
Yeah. He'd have the certificate, but he's using someone else's call sign. That makes the person who owns the station
Okay.
responsible for everything he does.
That answers why
Yeah, that's the situation that comes
I
into
got the
play.
answer wrong for that reason.
Okay.
That it was both the control operator and the amateur
Yes.
station. When
Some-
they mean station owner, they mean the one who's got the
Yeah.
certificate for that piece of equipment.
Yeah, a good example is a club station. Or say, for instance, the Sudbury Amateur Radio Club, they have a club station. If you have an amateur radio certificate and you're visiting, you can go in and play with their equipment. If they need an operator or whatever, you show your certificate, they'll usher you into their room and you can play with their radios. And you're the control operator.
Mhm.
You're responsible for what
But
you
you have
do.
the station
But
owner.
you're identifying under that club call sign. So whoever is the person who is holding that call sign, he's going to be also responsible.
But if you have your own call sign, you use your own? No?
They won't want you to do that.
Okay.
Because the purpose of putting a guest operator in that
Yeah.
station is to get that station on the air.
Right. Okay.
But yes, you can use your own call sign on the station if you want. If you have one.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So really important to know that amateur equipment does not require any certification. A lot of equipment does. Because it can be built by advanced amateurs and so on. You can get it from anywhere in the world. We don't care where it comes from or how it's built or anything like that, just as long as when you're operating it, you don't go outside a band, you don't use more power than you're supposed to use, and you don't cause problems because of its design.
So there's no requirement for CSA, UL, C, nothing like that?
Nothing.
Really?
Yeah. Other services, that has to be approved for use in Canada, but the amateur radios are not that way. But the operator is always responsible to be operating equipment that doesn't cause interference. So that's really what we're concerned about, what goes on the air. And comes to point 23. Radio equipment used in other services requires approval or certification. So if you see a question on the exam about approval and certification, and it might go one way, does this radio require approval? This one not, whatever. If it's going to be used in the amateur radio service, no approval. If it's outside, yeah, there's going to be approval required. And an amateur radio station can operate in any location in Canada, as I already covered. All frequencies are on a shared basis. First come, first served. So essentially, if you're on the frequency, if someone's on the frequency, you don't stomp over them and say, this is my frequency, get off. Can't do that. Go somewhere else. First one on the frequency has it. Interference to communications is called harmful interference. That will be on the test. Get used to the term, harmful interference. And what is harmful interference? Harmful interference is an interference which repeatedly disrupts or interferes with a radio communication. Disrupts or interferes with. Just remember that. Amateur communications may be divulged, but the transmissions of other services may not be. Your receiver will pick up stuff that's not ham, amateur related. You may even tune out of the ham bands and be a short wave listener. If there's something politically sensitive going on that you pick up and you start discussing it, you could end up in trouble for mentioning it, especially if it's a point-to-point communication, military or something like that, and it's not encrypted and you happen to get it, it falls back to you, you could be in trouble. So you can't give information out to other people of what you hear on the radio frequencies.
How often would that actually happen?
Very rare.
Yeah.
But the rule's in there because they can pull it out. An interesting point is, do you know, most people don't know this, but your FM radio and your TV and your AM radios and all the rest of them, they all require a radio license to operate and possess. Did you know that?
Yeah.
However, they're under an exemption. That exemption can be pulled at any time. That's for war and stuff like that. It's in the regs. This specifically states that a person may not own or operate any radio apparatus unless specifically exempted by the minister. And there's a section about exemption for amateur radio. As soon as they wipe that section out, there's one, and there are other sections for other things. So all you got to do is pull out the broadcast radio exemption, one section, and that rule then drops into place. So it's like a sword of Damocles. It's always there if you ever want to enact it. Just a piece of trivia.
That's just for like a wartime situation.
Exactly. And you may not also be aware of this, that during the wartime, they did require a license, and that's when they put it in originally. And if you ever find an old radio, you may actually find a sticker on it that says possession of this radio without proper approval in a radio station license is illegal. I found one of those ones.
That would explain all those double cross systems during World War II. We had those guys with the radios, direct confinders, and all those.
That too, yes. That's how they found them, yes. Of course, they were doing that more in a wartime situation, and they were looking for, the spies and stuff. What they were doing is they were tuning in on the local oscillator frequency of the transmitter. So a lot of people, they don't understand how these things work. They think they're waiting for them to go da-da, da-da, da-da. How could they ever possibly trace someone who just sends a quick, you're 20 miles away and it's gone. How are you going to find it? How do you pull right up in front, like you see in the movies? Sometimes the movies are accurate in certain ways. They have these loops. What are they tracing? They're tracing the emissions from the local oscillator of the receiver. So while they're sitting there, as soon as they turn on their equipment, there's oscillators in that system, and usually around 3.5 kilohertz or something like that, and they're tracing these things. And they're tuned to that frequency, so they're looking for the local oscillator of a receiver. And since the receivers were illegal of any type, without authority, they knew anything they picked up was illegal, and they're going to go for it. That's how they found them.
Wouldn't that regulation also apply to just like civilian broadcasts of any type? If they interfere with government communications?
Yes, that's why the bands are set up that way. There's certain. That's why ham bands are not allocated broadcast radio frequencies. However, as Bruce put out, there are some exceptions where in certain areas of the world they said we're not giving these frequencies to the hams. We're going to use them for our local broadcast or whatever in our area. So the rest of the world said, well, okay, fine. It's a local distance. You're only communicating here. We'll have to live with the interference, and we're in our area. We're going to transmit on our frequencies, and when you're in your area, you'll transmit your way. And if there's some interference, well, you'll just have to live with it. Because it's unlikely to happen because their signals where they are so powerful they would obliterate most of the stuff that would come in the background. And when you're visiting their country, they won't let you use those frequencies if you're a ham. They'll say, okay, you can come in our country and you can use amateur radio, which they still have amateur radio operators, but in our country, this band is forbidden. You can't use it. And there are sections. If you go into the RBR4 document, there's a section that talks about regions, region 3, region 2. The world's been dissected into these regions, and according to the law, if you are an amateur radio operator and you cross one of those imaginary lines, you need to stop using that frequency band while you're in that region.
Are all these like universally agreed upon?
Yep.
So like, the only reason I bring this up is in the odd chance I might find myself out in, I don't know, Afghanistan or Africa or something down there, and I try to get onto the radio bands there. Will they have their own little sections that say, okay, you can use this?
Yes, they will.
Okay.
And if you're planning on traveling to any foreign countries, you need to contact that administration or get a certificate from the different sources that are available for the different types of certificates, which are agreed upon by the countries, that they'll recognize each other and give you the approval. So you need to do your research. Don't just show up on their doorstep and say, I got my Canadian amateur certificate, click, click, click. They'll throw you in jail, take all your equipment. Business commercials, secondary users. Experience, communications. No fees may be charged in regard to the operation of an amateur radio station. You cannot charge somebody money for using your station. You cannot pass messages for money. And as I mentioned earlier, stations may communicate in any known language. All stations must have a reliable means of determining the operating frequency of the transmitter. You need to know where you are. You should not be turning on a transmitter if you don't know what frequency it's on. Otherwise, you wouldn't know if you were in band. That will be on the test. They never miss that. The modulation of a radio telephony transmission must not exceed 100%. Talking about AM radio, single sideband. When you guys were talking about transmitters, they talked about modulation percentage. Once you exceed 100%, it creates distortion, it creates harmonics, and can cause all kinds of problems to other services and makes your station sound really bad too. That will also be on the test. Canada has no third-party restrictions. Now, what's a third-party restriction? Okay, third party is basically you're talking to somebody, and somebody says to you, the next time you're talking to so-and-so in such and such a country, tell them this. So the message isn't coming from you, it's coming from someone else. Now, in some countries, that's illegal. And it's up to you to know which ones. There's a list published. The department doesn't have it. You'll get it off the ITU site. What will happen is that a country or an administration will contact the ITU and you'll say, look, we don't want third-party transmissions going on between our country and anyone else's. So put us on your list. Canada has no such restrictions, but some countries do. You could probably guess some of them.
North Korea.
Probably, yeah. Third-party communications are prohibited by some countries. I just talked about that. ITU maintains a list. It's a good idea to know that all Canadian call signs either start with a VA, VE, V0, or VY. That may be on the test. The radio control of models is permitted on frequencies above 30 megahertz. So that means you cannot do controlling models on any frequency in the amateur radio bands that is below 30 megahertz. That will be on the test. Stations must also comply with the regulations of the International Telecommunications Union. I already mentioned them. They are an international body that tries to standardize the regulations as best as possible. And the amateurs are more consistent than some of the other countries, other radio systems. So there are some basic rules that apply to all radio stations of all services and all different types in the ITU. A lot of our regulations come to them, but there are a few little things that in the ITU that you just need to understand that you're also required to go by. That one of them would be third-party agreements. Antenna installations are governed by Industry Canada. We talked about that on Tuesday. The department has the final word on antenna installations. But we have documents which explain basically our policy. In the case of a conflict, when it comes time is whose word is going to be law, it's going to be ours. It's going to be the department. Exempted antenna installations are not required to contact their municipality or land use authority. As I mentioned, there are exempted stations. MCAB 2, good document to know about. That will probably be on the test. Deals with the resolution of radio frequency interference to radio sensitive devices. On Tuesday I talked about two types of interference. One to devices that are designed to receive radio waves, and one to devices that aren't designed to receive radio waves but do anyway. There is a level that's specified in MCAB that if there is a conflict and it becomes serious enough the department gets involved, we'll take a measurement, and if the field strength exceeds a certain number, then the transmitter is going to have to be adjusted accordingly. If it's below that number, then the other device is considered to be at fault. RF exposure limits are set by Health Canada. I mentioned that document also on Tuesday, Safety Code 6. That will be on the test. Now, when we talk about exemptions, as I've already covered them earlier, all the rules that we talked about, there's an exemption when the rules can be broken. For immediate protection of life or property, in responding to distress communications which appear to be unheard by other stations. Now, what does that mean? I mentioned it earlier. I want to add just one other little caution. If it is being responded to by other stations, stay away unless you're asked to help. Because now, if you interfere with a distress communication, there's some real serious penalties. But if the person who's in control that has imposed sealants on the station suddenly says, do we have a station in such and such a location that can render aid or assist, and it's your area, then yeah, you can assist, but you're always under the control of the controlling station. And I don't know if this will be on the test or not. It is on the radio operator restricted certificates. The controlling station in an emergency is the station in distress. Bandwidths. A lot of countries have some very elaborate rules about you can do this mode here and that mode there, and they actually restrict certain sections of the bands. You can only operate this mode in this section and so on. Canada doesn't do that. What Canada does is they just give general bandwidth restrictions, which you have to follow. And they are right here laid out for you. For CW, your bandwidth is 1 kilohertz. Maximum. Single sideband, 2.8 kilohertz. AM, 6 kilohertz. FM, 15 kilohertz. Slow scan TV, 140 hertz. 2.5 kilohertz or 500 kilohertz. Now, slow scan would be used on HF frequencies, lower frequencies below 30 megahertz. Fast scan TV, you can go up to 6 megahertz. Now, the only bands that would be useful for that would be bands that are above 30 megahertz, because a lot of bands are not even 6 megahertz wide. 2 meter band, for instance, is not even 6 megahertz wide. So you couldn't use fast scan on 2 meters. So it can only be accommodated in higher frequency bands that are large enough to contain the emission. Privileges. Basic operator has all frequencies above 30 megahertz. You can use commercially designed equipment only. You can have a maximum power of 560 watts peak envelope power, which is your sideband signal, 190 watts carrier, which would be CW, and they talk about a limitation of 250 watts DC input to the linear or transmitter. And they can also install and operate cross-band repeaters. But they may not install and operate a repeater that operates within the same band. In other words, the transmit and receive frequency are in the same band. They can't. The reason is, I'll give you an example, 2 meters for instance. In order to operate a duplex repeater system within the 4 megahertz slice, which is the 2 meter band, you need a fair amount of filtering in order to have these things share an antenna or operate without causing interference. The setting up of this filtering is very tricky, and the equipment to get these things to work is beyond the ability of what the basic operator would be able to handle. So the department has determined that the possibility of interference from trying to set this thing up with not knowing what you're doing to other services is just too high. So they don't allow it. This could be in all other bands. Filtering improperly adjusted can create harmonics and cause all other kinds of problems. So it's a no. But in the case of a crossband system, like for instance from 2 meter to 440, you don't need a duplexer. The frequencies are so far apart, 2 antennas, you know, there's no duplexer involved. There's no, you know.
But they can't crossband into the lower frequencies, into the HF band.
We'll talk about that.
Okay.
That's another band, and it is. No, we'll talk about it. Yeah, but we'll get to that. Okay. The basic with honors, or 5 words per minute, will give you access to frequencies below 30 megahertz, which is your HF band. That means that if you get 80% on your exam when you write it, you will have access to 30 megahertz. You'll still have all the restrictions under the basic, but in addition, you will be allowed to use the HF bands. However, if you didn't get honors, you won't be able to do that. But on the other hand, if you pass a 5 word per minute code test, you get the same privileges. So there's more than one way to get it. Advanced certificates, you get all frequencies. You get to build, design, and modify and maintain your equipment. You can use a maximum power of 2,260 watts peak envelope power, 750 watts carrier, and you can have a transmitter capable of 1,000 watts DC input. You can operate in-band repeaters, and you can also remotely control fixed radio stations. Should mention that basic operators may not remotely control fixed operating stations. And you can sponsor a club radio station. If you don't have your advanced, you can't be a sponsor for a club radio station. So, to prepare for the exam, my recommendations are: commit the frequencies in Schedule 1 in RBR4 to memory. They're not that difficult. Note the bands that are shared or have restrictions, as in bandwidth and power. There's just a couple of them. Note Section 7 of CPC 2-0-03. We talked about it on Tuesday. That's the antenna and structure regulations. Know how to convert from meters to frequency. Your frequency bands can be measured in meters or can be measured in megahertz. If somebody tells you a frequency of 7.2 megahertz is in the 80 meter band. Are you going to believe him? Anybody know what band it is in? Not the guys who got their certificates.
Not the guy with the hat.
7 megahertz. 40, yes. Those are the kind of questions you're going to get hit with. Know the difference.
When I woke up at 2 o'clock this morning,
Mhm.
figuring it out, how to do it.
Yep, that'll be on the test. And have a look at the policy questions in the question bank, section B001 and 002, 003. Remember I mentioned there's certain banks? It'd be a good idea to have a look at that bank particularly. They're available off the web. You can print them in a PDF file. You know, it's easy. Read, and when you're doing the exam, I cannot stress this enough. Even I get caught. Read the question carefully. Watch for phrases like not correct, is correct, true or is not true. Because a lot of times you get in there, you read the question, oh yeah, not true, and then you start reading the answers and you forget that this is one of those reverse questions, and you go, oh, that's the right answer. Well, no, you weren't asked for the right answer, you were asked for the wrong answer. So watch for that, because it'll get you. Note the frequency exposure limits for safety code 6, maximum and minimum effect, what frequency range? Very important, that will be on the test. There's a certain frequency range where there's more chance at the same power of emission of exceeding safety code 6 than on other frequency ranges. You should know that, because you will be asked. And when you're doing multiple choice questions, 3 answers are usually nonsense. Try to pick the most correct. But if it's a reverse question, pick the one that's the most wrong. Again, watch for correct versus incorrect terminology. They're trying to trick you. And the final statement I give you, if your answer conflicts with any of these key statements in this document, it's wrong. And that's the regulations. Any questions?
What about that question I asked?
Okay, ask your question.
About the, it said crossband, but so can a basic, can't crossband into the hand bands. It couldn't go from 2 meters to 10 meters.
A basic with honors?
Without
Can.
honors. Without honors, just a...
Yeah, again, this is the key. That's why the key to regulations are here. I mentioned that that you can only operate in bands that you are authorized for.
Oh,
So if you're a basic operator, your signal can never be heard on those frequencies. Therefore, no matter what method you use to get there, you can't go there. But if you have your honors certificate and you want to connect to, say, a crossband repeater that someone's operated, or even set one up yourself, that puts you from 2 meters onto one of the HF frequencies, yes, you can do that. However, there is one little thing about being a basic operator doing that. Basic operators may not remotely control a fixed radio station. Okay? So the department defines remote control as manipulating the parameters of the transmitter. So if the frequency is already preset, it's a preset link, and you're just turning it on and keying it up as a basic operator, you can do that on the HF bands or any other radio. But if you have to type in codes, and nothing can be shifted in frequency, lowered in power, adjusted modes, stuff like that, remotely, you're now remotely controlling a fixed station, you can't do that. So it's a fine line.
Advanced?
Advanced you can,
Okay.
but basic you can't.
When you're remote, correct me if I'm wrong, I know this may sound like a stupid question, but remotely controlled is literally what it says, remotely controlled. You're not in the same room
Correct.
as the transmitter
Mm-hmm.
you're connected, right?
That's right.
Okay, because I've heard remotely control being used differently than.
You know, that's why they specifically state fixed stations. You're remotely controlling a station that doesn't move. It's not remotely controlling a toy car or something like this is moving around. You can do that with your basic, no problem. But if you set up a station somewhere, and it's there, and it's connected up to AC power or battery or whatever it is, it doesn't move, and you're somewhere else, and you start adjusting the parameters of the station remotely, you can't do that unless you're advanced.
Even if you're the station owner, right?
Doesn't matter. You can't do it.
Like,
Under your certificate, you can't do it.
You just got these set of duties that you can do,
Yes,
regardless of whether or not you own the equipment.
correct.
Or you
Ownership
control
doesn't
it.
mean anything.
Exactly, okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
I know it's a fine point, and I've tried for a long time to get the department to change it. You know, to say, well, you know, let's not, you know, let's take a little bit of this out of here. I mean, the stuff is all plug and play now. You know, chances of interference are low. I mean, so what if he moves from this frequency to that frequency remotely?
Well, no, I mean,
But
I think what
there,
it is clarification.
yeah,
Like, you know, you just look, you got this level of permissions,
Mhm.
you can do. Here's the stuff you can't do. Anything else, don't bother.
yeah.
You know?
I mean, I was successful in getting them to realize that they needed to relax the build equipment stuff. Well, actually, it was really relaxed. It's just that it wasn't clearly stated in the regs. Now it's clearly stated that you can build commercial kits as a basic operator. That wasn't in there before. It's clearly in there now. And the other thing that we had to clarify was digital radios, and what constitutes a modification. For instance, can a basic operator buy a piece of commercial radio gear and reprogram it to operate on amateur radio frequencies? The old answer used to be no, that's a modification. You can't do that. But no, you can. Because the equipment was commercially designed to operate within a specific frequency range, and it has been approved. If you look on our approvals section, it states that this thing has been approved to operate between this frequency and that frequency. Well, the ham bands are in between it. Now, they're locked out because they have to be for the approval, but it's just a matter of reprogramming the software to make it work in the ham bands. There's no physical modification to the equipment. You're not playing around with other stuff. All you're doing is just opening it up that way. A basic operator can do that, but if they got to cut a wire or do anything else like that, no, they can't. That's a physical modification. That's where the line is drawn. We can probably take a break now.
Yep.